It was just another high-profile case in courtroom 237. But tensions were palpable the moment the defendant, a wealthy and arrogant CEO named Jonathan Carter, entered the room. His reputation as a man who used his fortune to manipulate the system preceded him. But this day, his audacity reached new heights. When Judge Anthony Harper, a respected black jurist known for his unwavering commitment to justice, entered the courtroom, Carter made a show of refusing to stand. A murmur rippled through the gallery as the judge took his seat. His expression calm but his presence commanding. "In this courtroom," Judge Harper said, his voice measured, "we respect the law, and that begins with respecting the process." Carter's smirk only grew wider, his disdain for the judge palpable. "Respect is earned, Your Honor," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. What happened next left everyone stunned. Over the course of the trial, Harper's quiet dignity and relentless pursuit of truth dismantled Carter's arrogant facade piece by piece. Witness after witness revealed the depth of Carter's corruption. And by the time the verdict was read, his confidence had turned to panic. The sentence? 30 years in federal prison without parole, and a mandate for his ill-gotten fortune to be used for community restitution. The courtroom erupted not in chaos, but in a rare, powerful moment of justice served. Stay with me, because this story isn't just about one man's downfall. It's about a system fighting to prove that no one is above the law, no matter how wealthy or powerful they may be. Let us know where you're watching from today. And if you believe justice matters, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire change. The courthouse was unusually quiet that morning, its marble halls echoing only the faint whispers of early arrivals. Judge Samuel Harper stood at the window of his chambers, watching the sun struggle to pierce the overcast sky. His dark hands gripped the edge of the sill, knuckles taut with the kind of tension that had become second nature to him over decades of navigating a world that demanded twice as much and offered half as little. The day's case loomed large in his mind: the People versus Jonathan Ackerman. A name synonymous with untouchable wealth. Ackerman had spent decades weaving a web of influence so vast it seemed to blot out the very idea of justice. And yet, here he was, scheduled to appear before Harper in courtroom 237. For Harper, this trial was more than just another case. It was a collision of lives, of principles, of histories that whispered truths too bitter to say aloud. It was about power and the abuses that came with it. It was about who could bend the world to their will and who was crushed beneath its weight. His clerk, Julia, knocked softly on the door. "Judge Harper, they're ready for you." He turned, adjusting the crisp black robes that symbolized a system he still believed in, though he'd seen its flaws more clearly than most. "Let's get to it," he said, his voice calm but firm. In the courtroom, the air was electric with tension. The gallery was filled with a cross-section of the city: retired teachers whose pensions had vanished, construction workers left jobless after Ackerman's fraudulent developments, and a sprinkling of suited men whose unease betrayed their ties to the defendant. Harper took his seat on the bench, his commanding presence silencing the restless murmurs. At precisely 9:15, the prosecution table filled with Assistant District Attorney Amelia Reyes and her team. Reyes, young but unflinchingly resolute, shuffled through a stack of papers, her face a mask of determination. Across the room, Ackerman's table remained conspicuously empty. By 9:27, the doors swung open, and Jonathan Ackerman entered, flanked by his attorney, Catherine Malone. He was a man accustomed to commanding rooms, his silver hair immaculately combed, his tailored suit a reminder that wealth often masqueraded as respectability. He didn't so much walk as glide, exuding an arrogance that seemed to mock the very idea of accountability. Ackerman took his seat without so much as a glance at the judge. Harper's dark eyes narrowed. It wasn't the first time he'd seen such disdain, but it never ceased to ignite a slow burn of frustration deep in his chest. "Mr. Ackerman," Harper said, his tone measured, "in this courtroom, we observe certain protocols. One of those is standing when the judge enters." Ackerman finally looked up, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "My apologies, Your Honor," he drawled, though his tone suggested he was anything but sorry. "I wasn't aware of the local customs." The tension in the room thickened as Harper leaned forward. "Respect for this court is not a custom, Mr. Ackerman. It is a requirement. Stand." For a moment, Ackerman didn't move. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with deliberate slowness, he rose to his feet. Harper let the silence linger before giving a curt nod. "You may be seated." As the morning progressed, the prosecution laid out its opening arguments, detailing how Ackerman's schemes had devastated entire communities. Reyes painted a picture of greed unbound by morality, of a man who saw laws not as boundaries but as obstacles to be overcome. Harper watched the jury's faces, noting their growing discomfort, their dawning realization of the scale of the crimes before them. But beneath the surface of the trial, another story simmered, a story not spoken aloud but felt in every glance, every hesitation. It was the story of a black judge presiding over the fate of a white billionaire in a country still haunted by its past. Harper could feel the weight of it pressing against his shoulders, an unspoken challenge to his integrity that he had spent his entire career fighting to overcome. At the midday recess, Harper retreated to his chambers. He barely had time to sip his coffee before Julia entered, her expression tight. "You should see this," she said, handing him a note. The words were simple but chilling. "Watch your back. Ackerman owns more than just buildings." Harper's hand tightened around the paper. It was not the first threat he'd received, nor would it be the last. But it carried the same old sting, the reminder that even in his position, he was not untouchable. Not in a world where power shielded the corrupt and punished the principled. By the afternoon, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The defense began its counter-arguments, with Malone masterfully deflecting attention from Ackerman's misdeeds to procedural technicalities. The prosecution, she argued, has built a house of cards on shaky evidence. Mr. Ackerman is being unfairly targeted, a scapegoat for systemic issues far beyond his control. The words struck a nerve, not because they held truth but because they were so deftly wielded. Harper could see it in the faces of some jurors, the seeds of doubt being sown. The familiar tug of narratives that blamed everyone and no one, ensuring accountability was always just out of reach. The day ended with a brief confrontation that would set the tone for what was to come. As the court adjourned, Ackerman rose and turned to Harper. "This city," he said, his voice low but carrying, "has a way of eating men like you alive. Men who think they can change the rules." Harper met his gaze, unflinching. "This city has seen worse men than you, Mr. Ackerman, and it's still standing." Ackerman's smile faltered for just a moment, and Harper felt a flicker of satisfaction. But as the courtroom emptied, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight ahead would test him in ways he hadn't yet imagined. That night, as Harper sat in his study reviewing the day's transcripts, the weight of the trial settled heavily on him. He thought of the people in the gallery, their hope fragile but visible. He thought of his wife, who had warned him to be careful, and his grandson, who looked up to him with unshakable faith. Outside, the city buzzed with life, indifferent to the struggles playing out within its walls. Harper stared out the window, his reflection faint against the darkening skyline. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the pursuit of justice would demand everything he had to give. If you agree with the integrity and courage shown by Judge Harper in standing firm for justice, press 1 to show your support and let us know you're with him in the fight for truth. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 237, casting long shadows on the polished wooden benches. The gallery was already filling, a slow hum of conversation underscoring the anticipation of what was to come. Judge Samuel Harper entered the courtroom with his usual unyielding gait, his robes flowing like armor. The quiet authority in his presence brought the murmurs to an immediate halt. At the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Amelia Reyes flipped through her notes with an air of quiet determination. Across the aisle, Catherine Malone conferred in hushed tones with Jonathan Ackerman. He was leaning back in his chair, exuding the same careless confidence as before, as if this courtroom and everyone in it were merely obstacles to be brushed aside. Harper took his seat, his gavel striking wood with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the building. "Court is now in session," he announced, his voice steady, but with a weight that demanded attention. The morning began with procedural motions from the defense. Malone was sharp, her words measured and precise as she argued for the dismissal of key pieces of evidence. She challenged the validity of the warrants that had uncovered Ackerman's offshore accounts, painting the investigation as overzealous and flawed. "Your Honor," Malone said, her tone smooth and polished. The prosecution's case is built on shaky foundations. If this court allows such a blatant disregard for due process, it sets a dangerous precedent. Reyes stood to counter, her voice steady but impassioned. Your Honor, the evidence was obtained legally. The only precedent being set here is that no one, not even a billionaire, is above the law. Harper listened intently, his sharp gaze moving between the two attorneys. Beneath their words lay a deeper current, one that hinted at the larger stakes of this trial. It wasn't just about Ackerman's guilt or innocence. It was about whether the justice system could hold its ground against those who believed themselves untouchable. Motion denied. Harper finally ruled. Malone's calm mask faltered for just a moment, but Ackerman's smirk remained. As the day progressed, Reyes called her first witness, Sarah Davidson, a former accountant for Ackerman Enterprises. She was a petite woman with a quiet demeanor, but her voice carried the weight of years spent grappling with guilt and fear. Ms. Davidson, Reyes began, can you describe your role at Ackerman Enterprises? Davidson glanced nervously at Ackerman before answering. I was responsible for managing the company's financial records, including payroll and account reconciliations. And during your time there, did you notice any irregularities? Yes, Davidson said, her voice trembling slightly. There were transfers, large sums of money being moved into accounts that didn't belong to any of our known vendors. When I asked about it, I was told to mind my own business. Reyes pressed her gently but firmly, guiding Davidson to recount the pattern of financial misconduct she had uncovered. As the story unfolded, the gallery listened in stunned silence. Millions of dollars siphoned from pension funds. Shell companies used to funnel bribes. Community development projects abandoned after Ackerman drained their budgets. Ackerman's smirk finally disappeared. His jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on Davidson with a cold intensity. When it was Malone's turn to cross-examine, the courtroom felt like a battlefield. She moved with precision, her questions designed to chip away at Davidson's credibility. Ms. Davidson, Malone began, her tone deceptively gentle. Isn't it true that you were terminated from Ackerman Enterprises for incompetence? Davidson's face flushed. I was terminated because I refused to falsify financial reports. And yet, you have no physical evidence to support these claims. Malone pressed, circling like a predator. No emails, no documents, just your word against my clients. Davidson faltered, and Harper felt the tension in the room shift. The defense was exploiting the same old tactic, turning doubt into a shield for power. It was a game Harper had seen play out countless times before. And it never failed to ignite a quiet fury within him. Ms. Malone, Harper interjected, his tone firm. The witness's testimony is admissible. Your questions are veering into speculation. Proceed with facts. Malone offered a tight-lipped smile. Of course, Your Honor. By midday, the trial took a darker turn. During a recess, Reyes rushed into Harper's chambers, her usually composed demeanor replaced with urgency. Your Honor, she began, our key witness Thomas Bradford just backed out. He says someone's been following his kids. Harper's jaw tightened. Did he report it to the police? Reyes shook her head. He doesn't trust them. And honestly, neither do I, not with Ackerman's reach. The unspoken reality hung between them. This wasn't just about money or power, it was about a system that had allowed Ackerman to thrive. A system that, despite its outward appearances, was still riddled with fractures born of greed, fear, and, yes, prejudice. Harper leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. We'll subpoena him if we have to. But you and I both know that this case won't be won on a single testimony. Keep building the narrative, piece by piece. Reyes nodded, though her eyes betrayed her doubts. As she left, Harper felt the weight of the trial press harder against him. The threats, the intimidation, it was all part of the playbook. A grim reminder of the forces at work beneath the surface. The afternoon brought more revelations. Reyes introduced financial records linking Ackerman's offshore accounts to payments made to city officials and police officers. The evidence was damning, but Harper noticed something troubling. Certain documents seemed incomplete, as if key pieces had been removed or altered. During a brief recess, Harper received another note, slipped discreetly onto his desk. Your integrity won't protect you forever. The words were simple, but the message was clear. He was being watched, and not just by those in the courtroom. As the day drew to a close, The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Malone filed yet another motion, this time to dismiss the financial records as inadmissible. She argued that the chain of custody had been compromised, citing the discrepancies in the documents. Reyes countered with a passion that bordered on fury. Your Honor, the defense is trying to distract from the truth. These records are part of a larger pattern of corruption that cannot be ignored. Harper's gavel struck again, cutting through the heated exchange. Motion denied. We will proceed with the evidence as presented. Ackerman's composure cracked, his voice rising for the first time. This is a joke, he spat. A kangaroo court run by people who don't understand the first thing about progress. Harper's gaze was cold and steady. Mr. Ackerman, one more outburst, and you'll find yourself in contempt. The room fell silent, the weight of Harper's words settling over everyone present. The power dynamics in the courtroom had shifted, but the battle was far from over. That night, Harper sat alone in his study, the day's events replaying in his mind. The trial was exposing more than just Ackerman's crimes, it was peeling back the layers of a system that had long prioritized wealth and privilege over justice. It was a system Harper had spent his entire life trying to change. Brick by brick. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm, oblivious to the battles being fought within its walls. Harper stared out the window, his reflection faint against the darkening skyline. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, and new revelations, but for tonight, he allowed himself a moment of stillness, drawing strength from the knowledge that, no matter how heavy the weight of shadows, the light was still worth fighting for. The sun rose reluctantly that morning, veiled by heavy clouds that seemed to mirror the tension gripping the city. In courtroom 237, the day began with an eerie quiet, as though even the air knew the weight of what was to come. Judge Samuel Harper arrived early, his usual calm demeanor marked by a faint tightness in his jaw. Today felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very foundations of the courthouse trembled under the strain of the truths waiting to be unearthed. The first order of business was the continuation of Sarah Davidson's testimony. She sat at the witness stand, visibly worn from the previous day's grilling by Catherine Malone. Despite her fatigue, there was a determination in her eyes, a glimmer of hope that justice might still prevail. Reyes began her questioning with a measured tone, carefully guiding Davidson through the intricacies of the financial records she had uncovered. As the details unfolded, the gallery sat in hushed anticipation, the weight of the revelations settling like a heavy fog. Ms. Davidson, Reyes asked, holding up a stack of documents, can you confirm that these are the transfer records you personally handled during your time at Ackerman Enterprises? Davidson nodded, her voice steady despite the tension. Yes, these show the funds being funneled into offshore accounts through shell companies. Each transfer was marked as a payment for services that were never rendered. Reyes took a moment to let the words sink in before continuing. And who authorized these transfers? Davidson hesitated, her gaze flickering toward Ackerman. Mr. Ackerman personally approved every one. At the defense table, Ackerman leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. But Harper noticed the subtle clenching of his jaw, the faint twitch in his fingers, a crack in the polished facade. Malone's cross-examination began with her characteristic precision, but today there was an edge to her voice, a hint of frustration that she couldn't quite conceal. Ms. Davidson, Malone said, pacing slowly, isn't it true that you only came forward after being terminated from your position? Yes, Davidson admitted, and isn't it also true? Malone interrupted. That you were facing personal financial difficulties at the time? Davidson's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. That has nothing to do with the truth of what I'm saying. Perhaps, Malone replied, her tone dripping with condescension, but it certainly raises questions about your motives. The gallery murmured, a low hum of unease that Harper quickly silenced with a sharp rap of his gavel. Ms. Malone, proceed with your questioning or move on. Malone inclined her head, her smile tight. Of course, Your Honor. The morning wore on with more testimony, each new piece of evidence painting a clearer picture of the vast web of corruption Ackerman had spun. Reyes introduced emails detailing backroom deals and payments to city officials, while Davidson confirmed the authenticity of each one. But just as the momentum seemed to swing decisively in the prosecution's favor, the tide shifted. During a recess, Reyes received a call from an anonymous source. The voice on the other end was hushed. Almost frantic. "You need to check the evidence locker," it said before abruptly hanging up. Reyes rushed to the locker, only to find it in chaos. Files were missing, and others had been tampered with. Her stomach sank as she realized the implications. Someone on the inside was working to sabotage the case. She stormed into Harper's chambers, her frustration barely contained. "Your Honor, we have a serious problem. Evidence is disappearing, and I have reason to believe it's being orchestrated by someone with ties to the defense." Harper's expression darkened, his anger a quiet, simmering force. "Do you have proof?" "Not yet," Reyes admitted, "but I'm working on it. If we don't get ahead of this, the entire case could fall apart." Harper nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "We'll increase security on all remaining evidence. And Reyes, be careful. Whoever's behind this won't hesitate to escalate." The afternoon brought another blow. A key witness, Thomas Bradford, failed to appear in court. Reyes frantically tried to reach him, only to learn that his home had been vandalized the night before. The message was clear: stay silent, or else. Harper called for a brief recess, retreating to his chambers to regroup. The pressure was mounting, and the unspoken truths beneath the trial were becoming harder to ignore. This wasn't just about Ackerman's crimes, it was about the ways in which power, privilege, and prejudice had shaped the very fabric of the system. It was about who was allowed to speak, and who was silenced. When court resumed, the tension in the room was palpable. Reyes called her next witness, a junior accountant who had worked under Davidson. But as the young man began to testify, he faltered, his voice shaking. They told me not to say anything," he stammered, glancing nervously toward the gallery. They said they'd make me regret it." Harper leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "You're safe here. No one can harm you in this courtroom." The young man nodded, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I saw the records. I knew what was happening. But I was too scared to speak up. Ackerman has people everywhere, cops, politicians, even judges." The gallery erupted in whispers, the weight of the accusations sending ripples through the room. Harper banged his gavel, restoring order. But the damage had been done. The trial was no longer just about Ackerman, it was about the very integrity of the justice system itself. As the day drew to a close, Harper felt the strain of the trial settling heavily on his shoulders. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, their signs demanding accountability and justice. But beneath their calls for reform lay a deeper, more insidious question. Could the system truly be trusted to deliver justice when it had so often failed those who needed it most? Harper stared out the window of his chambers, the city a blur of lights and shadows. The fight ahead would be long and grueling. But he knew one thing for certain: he would not back down. Not now. Not ever. The morning air was thick with unease as Judge Samuel Harper stepped into the courtroom. The previous day's revelations had left a palpable tension hanging in the room. And it seemed that everyone present, jurors, attorneys, spectators, felt its weight. Harper, however, carried it differently. His back was straight, his stride deliberate. To show weakness now, in the face of mounting chaos, would be to yield ground he could not afford to lose. The prosecution was scheduled to call its next witness, but Amelia Reyes had not yet arrived. Harper scanned the room, his sharp gaze settling on the empty chair at the prosecution table. A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery, broken only when the courtroom doors creaked open and Reyes entered, her face a mask of barely concealed frustration. "I apologize for the delay, Your Honor," she said, setting her files down. "There have been complications." Harper gave a curt nod. He didn't need her to elaborate, he could see it in the lines etched into her brow. The case was unraveling not from lack of merit, but from the relentless interference of forces determined to bury the truth. The first witness of the day was Officer Michael Sullivan, a young patrolman with a reputation for integrity in a department where such a quality had become a rarity. He approached the stand with visible unease, his uniform crisp but his hands trembling slightly as he was sworn in. Reyes began her questioning gently, aware of the delicate balance she had to strike. "Officer Sullivan," she said, "can you describe the events that led to your knowledge of Mr. Ackerman's activities?" Sullivan swallowed hard. "It started with small things," he said, his voice low but steady. "Missing evidence, cases involving powerful people getting dismissed without explanation. I noticed patterns, names that kept coming up. Payments that didn't make sense. And then there were the whispers. Whispers? Reyes prompted. Sullivan hesitated, glancing toward the gallery. About Ackerman. About how he had the department in his pocket. They called him the silent partner. If you crossed him, you didn't just lose your job, you lost everything. The courtroom fell silent as his words sank in. Harper watched the jurors closely, noting the mix of shock and discomfort that flickered across their faces. But it was Ackerman's reaction that drew his attention. The man's usual air of unshakable confidence had given way to a subtle tension, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythmic staccato. When it was Catherine Malone's turn to cross-examine, she wasted no time. "Officer Sullivan," she began, her voice sharp and precise. "Are you suggesting that an entire police department has been compromised by one man?" "No," Sullivan admitted, "not everyone, but enough." Malone pounced on the admission. "Enough? That's a vague accusation, wouldn't you agree? Can you provide specific names, dates, or evidence to back up these claims?" Sullivan faltered, his resolve wavering under her relentless scrutiny. I don't have hard proof. But I've seen things, heard things, seen things, heard things," Malone repeated with a smirk. "Hardly the foundation of a credible accusation, wouldn't you say?" Before Sullivan could respond, Harper intervened. "Ms. Malone, the witness's observations are relevant to establishing context. Continue." Malone's smile tightened, but she returned to her seat without further protest. Harper felt a flicker of satisfaction. Whatever Malone's strategy, it was clear that the defense was feeling the strain. The afternoon session brought a new layer of tension. Reyes had planned to introduce testimony from Thomas Bradford, the whistleblower whose absence the previous day had raised alarms. This time, Bradford appeared, flanked by federal agents who had assured his safety. But the man who took the stand was a shadow of the confident informant Reyes had once known. His hands shook as he adjusted the microphone, and he avoided eye contact with the gallery. "Mr. Bradford," Reyes began carefully, "can you tell the court why you chose to come forward?" Bradford hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Ackerman before settling on his lap. Because what he's doing is wrong," he said finally. "People are losing their homes, their jobs, their futures. Someone had to say something." "And what specifically did you witness?" Reyes pressed. Bradford's voice grew stronger as he recounted late-night meetings in Ackerman's private office. The flow of money through offshore accounts, and the deliberate destruction of records that might implicate him. The gallery listened intently, the weight of his words pressing down on the room like a physical force. But as Bradford spoke, Harper noticed a figure at the back of the courtroom, a man in plain clothes. His posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the witness with an intensity that made Harper's stomach twist. The unspoken threat was clear, even here. In this supposed sanctuary of justice, danger lurked. During the recess, Harper called Reyes into his chambers. "That man in the gallery," he said without preamble. "Do you know who he is?" Reyes nodded grimly. "One of Ackerman's enforcers. I've been told he's there to monitor the trial." Harper's jaw tightened. "And you didn't think to mention this earlier?" "I didn't want to cause a scene," Reyes admitted, "but I've already flagged it with the marshals. They're keeping an eye on him. Make sure they do more than watch," Harper said, his voice like steel. "We're not losing this case to intimidation." The final blow of the day came as the court prepared to adjourn. As Harper was gathering his notes, a court officer approached with an envelope. Inside was a single photograph, his daughter, Sharon, walking Tommy to school. Beneath it, a message scrawled in red ink: "Stay in your lane." Harper's grip on the photo tightened, his vision narrowing as a surge of anger coursed through him. He thought of his daughter's laughter, his grandson's wide-eyed innocence. He thought of the countless nights he'd spent trying to shield them from the shadows that followed him. The message was clear, but Harper was not a man to be cowed. He would not be silenced. Not by threats, not by power, and certainly not by fear. As the day ended, Harper sat alone in his chambers, the photograph still clutched in his hand. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the battle being waged within its walls. The trial was no longer just a matter of guilt or innocence. It was a fight for something far greater, a fight for justice, for integrity, for the soul of a system that had long turned a blind eye to its own corruption. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, and new dangers, but Harper was ready. He had faced worse storms. And he had no intention of faltering now. The courtroom was a battlefield. Judge Samuel Harper stood behind his bench, his expression as resolute as stone, though his eyes betrayed the weight of the forces pressing in from all sides. He had received threats before. A judge who dared to confront power inevitably drew fire. But this time, the stakes felt impossibly high. This trial wasn't just about Jonathan Ackerman's crimes, it was about the very foundation of justice. And whether it could withstand the corrosive influence of money, corruption, and the silent but ever-present specter of racism. The gallery was packed again, filled with faces that bore the lines of lives lived in a system that often failed them. Some watched with hope, others with doubt, and a few with outright skepticism. Harper had seen it all before. But today, he couldn't ignore the subtle tension in the room. A reminder that this trial was about more than one man. It was about the people who had been silenced, ignored, and dismissed. The day began with a shock. Reyes, armed with her characteristic determination, called her next witness, Margaret Wilson, a community organizer whose neighborhood had been gutted by Ackerman's fraudulent housing developments. Margaret took the stand, her posture firm, her voice steady despite the quiet hostility emanating from the defense table. Ms. Wilson, Reyes began, can you describe the impact of Mr. Ackerman's actions on your community? Margaret nodded, her gaze unwavering. He promised affordable housing, jobs, and revitalization. What we got were half-built developments, evictions, and empty lots. People lost their homes, their livelihoods. We were nothing more than pawns in his game. Reyes guided Margaret through her testimony, laying bare the human cost of Ackerman's greed. The gallery listened intently, their murmurs growing louder with each revelation. Harper could feel the tension building, a steady drumbeat of anger and frustration. But as Margaret detailed the broken promises and shattered lives, Catherine Malone rose for cross-examination, her expression sharp and calculating. Ms. Wilson, Malone began, isn't it true that your organization accepted a donation from Ackerman Enterprises? Yes, Margaret admitted, but that was before we knew what he was doing. And yet, you continued to attend his public events and even posed for photos with him. Malone pressed, wouldn't you say that undermines your credibility? Margaret faltered, the weight of the accusation momentarily stealing her voice. Harper intervened, his tone firm but measured. Ms. Malone, the witness's past associations are not on trial here. Please keep your questions relevant to the matter at hand. Malone backed down, but the damage was done. The gallery buzzed with uncertainty. And Harper could feel the pendulum swinging, however slightly, back toward Ackerman. The morning's tension was nothing compared to what came next. During a brief recess, Reyes received another anonymous tip. It was a single, chilling sentence. Check the jurors. She moved quickly, alerting Harper and the court officers. Within minutes, the whispers spread. One of the jurors, Patricia Walker, had received a mysterious deposit into her bank account, $50, an unmistakable bribe. Harper called an emergency session in his chambers, summoning both Reyes and Malone. The tension in the room was suffocating as they reviewed the evidence. This is outrageous, Malone said, her tone indignant. There's no proof my client had anything to do with this. Really? Reyes shot back, because $50 doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Harper raised a hand, silencing them both. His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. This trial will not devolve into chaos. Ms. Walker will be questioned. And if we find evidence of misconduct, she will be removed from the jury. Malone's expression hardened. Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to derail my client's defense. No, Ms. Malone, Harper replied, his gaze piercing. This is an attempt to preserve the integrity of this court. The investigation into the juror only deepened the drama. Ms. Walker denied any knowledge of the deposit. But the evidence against her was damning. When confronted with the bank records, she broke down, confessing that she had been approached by an anonymous figure who threatened her family. The gallery erupted in outrage when the news broke. Harper had to call for order multiple times as the whispers turned to angry murmurs. The sense of betrayal was palpable, not just from the jurors but from the community watching this trial unfold. Your Honor, Reyes said, her voice shaking with anger. This is exactly the kind of manipulation that Mr. Ackerman thrives on. He's not just trying to avoid justice, he's trying to destroy the very system that holds him accountable. The afternoon brought a rare moment of clarity. Reyes introduced a new piece of evidence, a recording from one of Ackerman's board meetings, provided by an anonymous whistleblower. In the recording, Ackerman could be heard laughing about his schemes, his voice dripping with disdain. "They'll never touch me," he said. "People like Harper, Reyes, they think they can change the world with their little rules. But rules are for people who can't afford to break them." The words landed like a thunderclap. The gallery fell silent, the weight of Ackerman's arrogance hanging heavy in the air. Harper allowed the moment to linger before addressing the court. "Let the record show," he said, his voice steady but edged with steel, "that this court does not bow to money or power. We deal in truth." As the day drew to a close, the pressure in the room was unbearable. Harper returned to his chambers, his mind racing. The threats, the bribes, the manipulation, it was all part of a larger pattern, a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of everyone else. He thought of his own journey, of the barriers he had faced as a black man rising through the ranks of the judiciary. The quiet assumptions, the unspoken doubts, the way people had questioned his every decision not because of what he did, but because of who he was. And now, here he was, standing against a man who embodied everything wrong with the system Harper had sworn to uphold. The photograph of his daughter and grandson still sat on his desk, a reminder of what was at stake. Harper picked it up, his grip firm. He would not be intimidated. Not for his family, not for his community, and not for himself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But Harper was ready. The line had been drawn, and he would not waver. Justice demanded nothing less. The city awoke to a sky streaked with gray, the kind of overcast that seemed to press down on everything, leaving the streets quieter than usual. In courtroom 237, the mood was no less somber. Judge Samuel Harper arrived early, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls as he prepared himself for what he knew would be a pivotal day. The events of the previous day, the bribed juror, the damning recording had brought the trial to a boiling point. But Harper understood that the closer they came to the truth, the more dangerous the opposition would become. His clerk, Julia, knocked gently on his door. "Your Honor," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "The marshals have increased security. There were protests outside the courthouse this morning. Some of them were carrying signs with your name." Harper glanced at her, his expression steady but thoughtful. "What did they say?" Julia hesitated, then sighed. "Justice for all." But others said things like, "biased judge," and "resign now." Harper nodded, his mind churning. The trial was no longer just about Jonathan Ackerman's guilt. It had become a battleground for the soul of the justice system itself. And like every battle, it was drawing lines in the sand, lines shaped by power, wealth, and the unspoken truths about race that still haunted the nation. The courtroom filled quickly as the session began, the air thick with anticipation. Amelia Reyes looked weary but determined, her hands gripping a folder of new evidence. Catherine Malone, by contrast, seemed unnervingly composed, her cool demeanor suggesting she had prepared a counterstrike. Reyes called her next witness, Officer Michael Sullivan, the young patrolman who had quietly defied his corrupt superiors to provide critical information. Sullivan's testimony began slowly, recounting years of small, suspicious actions he had witnessed within the department, evidence disappearing, cases being dismissed without explanation, promotions granted to officers with questionable ethics. But as Sullivan spoke, the courtroom grew restless. Ackerman's presence at the defense table was a palpable force, his mere existence a reminder of the power imbalance that loomed over everything. Harper noticed the way jurors glanced at him, as though unsure whether they were witnessing the dismantling of an empire or the inevitable failure of justice. Then came the first explosion of the day. As Sullivan detailed a specific instance of evidence tampering, a case involving bribes paid to city officials, a man in the gallery stood abruptly. "Lies," he shouted, his voice reverberating through the room. "This is a witch hunt." The marshals moved quickly to escort the man out, but the interruption had already shaken the room. Harper banged his gavel, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Order. This court will not tolerate disruptions." The man glared at Harper as he was led away, his parting words hanging in the air. "You think you're different, Judge? They'll come for you, too." Harper sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The words were a threat. Yes, But they were also a bitter reminder of how deeply rooted the divisions in the room and the country truly were. During the recess, Reyes received a tip from an unexpected source, Margaret Wilson, the community organizer who had testified earlier. She had uncovered a series of payments made from Ackerman's accounts to a high-ranking police officer who had been responsible for overseeing key evidence in the trial. "We're talking millions," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling as she handed over the documents. "This isn't just about Ackerman. This is a whole network." Reyes brought the evidence to Harper's chambers immediately. As he reviewed the documents, his jaw tightened. The implications were staggering. Ackerman wasn't just corrupt, he was the nexus of a sprawling web of bribery and manipulation that extended into nearly every corner of the city's institutions. "We need to move on this now," Reyes said, her voice urgent. "If we wait, they'll bury this too." Harper nodded, his mind already racing. "Submit the evidence, but be prepared. This will escalate things. They won't go down without a fight." The afternoon session began with Reyes introducing the new evidence. But before she could explain its significance, Malone objected. "Your Honor," Malone said, rising to her feet, "this evidence is highly prejudicial and lacks proper verification. The prosecution is engaging in a fishing expedition." Reyes shot back, her voice sharp. "This evidence was obtained legally and directly implicates Mr. Ackerman in further acts of corruption. The defense is simply trying to delay the inevitable." Harper studied them both, his face impassive. Finally, he turned to Malone. "Objection overruled. The evidence will be admitted." The tension in the room thickened as Reyes laid out the details: wire transfers, falsified invoices, and a trail of money that connected Ackerman to key officials in the police department, city council, and even the judiciary. The gallery buzzed with shock. And for the first time, Harper noticed a flicker of genuine fear cross Ackerman's face. As the day wore on, the threats became more overt. Harper received another note. This one slipped onto his desk during a brief recess. "You think you're safe because you wear a robe? Think again." He folded the note carefully, placing it in his pocket. There was no time for fear, no space for hesitation. Justice demanded focus, and Harper had long since learned to channel his anger into action. The crescendo came late in the day. As Reyes prepared to call her final witness, a whistleblower from Ackerman's inner circle, an alarm sounded. The courthouse was evacuated after a bomb threat was called in, forcing the trial to pause. Outside, as Harper stood with his clerks and marshals, he noticed the way the crowd had swelled. Protesters on both sides shouted over one another, their voices a cacophony of anger, fear, and defiance. "This is what he wants," Reyes muttered beside him, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Chaos, confusion, anything to distract from the truth." Harper nodded, his expression grim. "Then we stay the course, no matter what." That night, Harper returned home to find his house under federal protection. His wife, Linda, greeted him at the door, her face a mixture of relief and worry. "You've done enough, Sam," she said softly. "Let someone else take the risk for once." Harper pulled her into an embrace, his mind replaying the day's events. "If I step back now," he said quietly, "what does that tell them? What does it tell Tommy? That we give in when it gets hard?" Linda sighed, resting her head against his chest. "Just don't let them take you from us. Sam, promise me that." He didn't answer, because the truth was, he couldn't promise anything. The trial had taken on a life of its own, and the closer they came to exposing Ackerman's empire, the more dangerous the game became. As Harper sat alone in his study that night, he stared at the growing stack of notes, threats, and evidence on his desk. The lines between right and wrong had never been clearer. But the path forward was fraught with peril. The forces against him were vast, and the fight was only beginning. But Samuel Harper was not a man who walked away from a fight. Not now, not ever. The morning arrived cloaked in a muted gray, the kind of day where even the sun seemed reluctant to show its face. Judge Samuel Harper walked into the courthouse with a deliberate calm, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor like a steady drumbeat. Yet beneath the surface, he was anything but calm. The threats, the disruptions, the bomb scare, they were all part of an unrelenting storm swirling around the trial. And Harper was standing at its very center. Inside courtroom 237, the atmosphere was electric. The gallery was packed, the hum of whispers filling the air like static. Reporters jostled for position. their cameras clicking as Harper took his seat on the bench. He scanned the room, his sharp gaze landing briefly on Jonathan Ackerman, whose arrogance seemed to falter for the first time. The billionaire sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes flickering with a nervous energy that betrayed the cracks in his facade. "Court is now in session," Harper intoned, his voice slicing through the noise like a blade. The room fell silent, but the tension remained a coiled spring waiting to snap. Amelia Reyes rose first, her posture as unyielding as her resolve. "Your Honor," she began, "today the prosecution will present testimony from a witness who was once inside Mr. Ackerman's inner circle. This testimony will expose not just the scope of his corruption, but the lengths to which he has gone to evade justice." The gallery stirred, and Harper could feel the weight of their anticipation. Reyes gestured toward the doors, and a marshal escorted in the witness, Cassandra Blake, Ackerman's former executive assistant. She was a striking figure, her presence commanding yet weary, as though the years of silence had taken their toll. "Ms. Blake," Reyes began, her tone firm but empathetic, "can you describe your role at Ackerman Enterprises?" Blake took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "I was Mr. Ackerman's executive assistant for 10 years. I handled his schedule, his correspondence, and, occasionally, tasks that went beyond my job description." "Tasks?" Reyes pressed. "Can you clarify what you mean by that?" Blake hesitated, her gaze shifting briefly to Ackerman, whose face had grown pale. "Bribes, intimidation, cover-ups. He trusted me to make sure no loose ends ever came back to him." The room erupted in murmurs, and Harper struck his gavel sharply. "Order." Reyes leaned in, her voice steady but intense. "Ms. Blake, can you provide specific examples?" Blake nodded, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "There was a reporter, Michael Foster. He uncovered evidence of money laundering. Ackerman ordered me to find out everything about him, his family, his habits, his vulnerabilities. When Foster refused to back off, Ackerman made sure he had an accident." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Harper felt his chest tighten. The mention of Foster, an investigative journalist whose death had long been ruled an accident, added a new, chilling dimension to the case. This wasn't just about money or power. Lives had been destroyed, snuffed out in the shadows of Ackerman's empire. Catherine Malone, ever the tactician, stood for her cross-examination. "Ms. Blake," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "isn't it true that you only came forward after being terminated from your position?" Blake straightened in her seat, her voice steady. "I came forward because I couldn't live with the lies anymore." "And yet," Malone continued, her smile tight, "you benefited from those lies for a decade. A 6-figure salary, luxury perks. Doesn't that make you complicit?" Blake's face reddened, but she held her ground. "Yes, I was complicit, and that's why I'm here to tell the truth, no matter the cost." Malone smirked, but Harper could see the cracks in her composure. Blake's testimony was damning, and Malone knew it. During the afternoon session, Reyes introduced new evidence, a series of emails from Blake's account detailing instructions from Ackerman to bribe city officials and sabotage investigations. The emails painted a vivid picture of a man who believed himself untouchable, a puppet master pulling strings behind the scenes. One email in particular stood out, dated just days before the trial began. It read, "Ensure the judge understands his place. He needs to know who really holds the power." Harper's stomach churned as he read the words aloud, his voice unwavering despite the fury burning inside him. The message wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration of war. As the day wore on, the tension reached a fever pitch. The gallery was restless, the jurors visibly shaken by the gravity of the evidence. But it was during a recess that the storm truly broke. Harper was in his chambers when Julia, his clerk, burst in, her face pale. "Your Honor," she stammered, "you need to see this." She handed him a tablet displaying a live video feed from outside the courthouse. Protesters had gathered, their chants echoing through the streets. But among them was a smaller, more sinister group, masked figures holding signs that read, "Down with Harper." "They're getting bold," Julia said, her voice trembling. "This isn't just about Ackerman anymore. They're targeting you." Harper set the tablet down, his jaw tightening. "Let them," he said quietly. "I've faced worse." The final session of the day was interrupted by yet another disruption. A loud crash echoed through the courtroom as someone hurled a brick through one of the windows. Chaos erupted, marshals moving swiftly to secure the room as Harper stood, his voice booming above the noise. "This trial will proceed," he declared, his words cutting through the pandemonium. "Justice does not yield to intimidation." The room fell silent, his resolve washing over them like a wave. Even Ackerman seemed momentarily subdued, his usual smirk replaced by something resembling unease. That night, Harper returned home to find federal agents stationed outside his house. Linda greeted him at the door, her face lined with worry. "They're escalating, Sam," she said softly. "How much longer can you keep this up?" Harper embraced her, his thoughts heavy. He thought of his grandson, Tommy, who had asked him just days ago what it meant to be brave. He thought of the people in the gallery, watching and waiting for proof that justice could still prevail. "This isn't just about Ackerman," he said finally. "It's about the system. If we let fear win now, what does that say about us?" Linda sighed, resting her head against his chest. "Just promise me you'll be careful." As Harper sat in his study that night, reviewing the day's transcripts, a new note was slipped under his door. It read simply, "The truth is a dangerous thing. Judge, be careful how much you reveal." He folded the note carefully and placed it in his desk. The threats, the violence, the chaos, it was all meant to break him, to make him doubt himself. But Harper was no stranger to standing firm in the face of adversity. He had spent his entire life walking a line that others tried to erase. Tomorrow, he would return to the courtroom, not as a man intimidated by power but as a judge determined to see justice served. The truth was dangerous, yes, but it was also the only weapon he needed. The morning light cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, where protesters and reporters jostled for space in an uneasy dance. Some held signs demanding justice for the victims of Jonathan Ackerman's schemes. Others waved placards accusing Judge Samuel Harper of bias and overreach. The juxtaposition of those messages, justice on one side, power on the other, mirrored the deeper conflict playing out within the walls of courtroom 237. Harper arrived under heavy security, his expression calm but unyielding. The death threats, the broken windows, the vitriol, it was all part of the game when truth confronted power. He had learned long ago that standing firm in the face of injustice came at a price. The question was not whether he could pay it but whether the system could withstand the weight of its own reckoning. Inside the courtroom, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Amelia Reyes sat at the prosecution table, her hands gripping a file of documents that could potentially break the case wide open. Across the aisle, Catherine Malone leaned back in her chair, exuding a false calm that Harper knew masked her growing desperation. And at the center of it all was Ackerman, his polished arrogance now giving way to visible cracks as the walls closed in. "Your Honor," Reyes began, rising to her feet, "the prosecution calls its next witness, Detective Marcus Whitman." A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. Whitman was a name that carried weight, a senior officer with a spotless public record but whispers of complicity in Ackerman's dealings. His testimony could shift the entire trial. Whitman entered the courtroom with the air of a man walking a tightrope. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, but his eyes betrayed the weight of the secrets he carried. He took the stand, and Harper could see the sweat glistening on his brow as he was sworn in. "Detective Whitman," Reyes began, her tone sharp but measured. "How long have you served in the city's police department?" 20 years, Whitman replied, his voice steady. "And during those 20 years, have you ever encountered instances of corruption within the department?" Whitman hesitated, glancing toward Ackerman, whose cold stare seemed to bore into him. "Yes," he said finally, the word falling like a stone in the silence. Reyes pressed on, "And can you confirm that some of this corruption involved Mr. Ackerman?" Whitman shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edges of the stand. "Yes," he admitted. "Ackerman, he had people everywhere. He used his money to buy influence, to silence investigations. If you didn't play along, he'd make sure you regretted it." The gallery erupted, the murmurs swelling into gasps and whispers. Harper struck his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Whitman's words hung in the air, undeniable and damning. Catherine Malone rose for a cross-examination, her demeanor cold and calculating. "Detective Whitman," she began, "you've just admitted to witnessing corruption. Were you complicit in these activities? Whitman hesitated, his jaw tightening. Yes, he said, his voice quieter now. I looked the other way. I took money. Malone pounced. So, by your own admission, you're a corrupt officer. Why should this court believe anything you say? Whitman looked down, his voice trembling. Because it's the truth, and it's time someone said it. The afternoon brought a revelation that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Reyes introduced evidence connecting Ackerman's shell companies to a string of arson cases, including the fire that had destroyed a low-income housing complex. The complex had been slated for redevelopment, a project awarded to Ackerman's company days after the fire. One by one, Reyes laid out the evidence: emails, financial transfers, and surveillance footage of Ackerman's associates near the site on the night of the fire. The gallery watched in stunned silence, their faces reflecting a mix of horror and outrage. When Reyes finished, she turned to Harper. Your Honor, the prosecution moves to amend the charges to include conspiracy to commit arson. Harper nodded, his voice firm. Motion granted. For the first time, Ackerman's composure broke. He leaned toward Malone, whispering furiously. Whatever he said, it didn't matter. The tide was turning, and he knew it. During a recess, Harper returned to his chambers to find a package waiting on his desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a list of names, including his own, under the heading Targets. His breath caught as he scanned the list. His name was circled, with a note scrawled beside it: do not let him reach sentencing. He sat back, the weight of the threat pressing against his chest. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about his family, his colleagues, and everyone who had dared to stand up to Ackerman's empire. The final session of the day brought a moment of unexpected defiance. As Reyes questioned a whistleblower about the inner workings of Ackerman's financial network, Ackerman himself stood abruptly, slamming his hands on the table. This is a farce, he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. A political witch hunt orchestrated by people who don't understand what it takes to build a legacy. Harper struck his gavel, his voice cutting through the chaos. Mr. Ackerman, you will sit down, or you will be removed. Ackerman hesitated, his arrogance faltering under Harper's glare. Slowly, he sat, but the outburst had left its mark. The gallery buzzed with renewed energy, the cracks in Ackerman's facade now impossible to ignore. That night, as Harper walked to his car under the watchful eyes of federal agents, he couldn't shake the weight of the day's events. The threats, the lies, the sheer audacity of Ackerman's defiance, it was all building to a breaking point. Back at home, he found Linda waiting for him, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. You're pushing yourself too hard, Sam, she said softly. They'll try to break you. Harper met her gaze, his voice steady. They've been trying to break me my whole life. I'm still here. As he sat in his study that night, reviewing the day's transcripts, he thought about the people in the gallery, the ones who had lost everything because of men like Ackerman. He thought about his grandson, Tommy, and the world he wanted to leave for him. This fight wasn't just about justice. It was about legacy, and Harper was determined to ensure that legacy was one of truth, no matter the cost. The courthouse felt different that morning, as though the building itself sensed the gravity of what lay ahead. A fog hung low over the city, muffling the sounds of traffic and cloaking the steps of courtroom 237 in an eerie stillness. Judge Samuel Harper arrived earlier than usual, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. His face was a mask of calm determination, but the weight of the past weeks bore down on his shoulders like lead. The trial had reached its breaking point. Harper knew this day would be pivotal, not just for the case, but for the system he had spent his life defending. The forces of power and privilege had never been so naked in their defiance, their contempt for truth. And yet, for all their posturing, Harper knew they were afraid. Fear was why Ackerman had lashed out. Fear was why the threats had escalated. Fear was why this fight mattered. The courtroom filled quickly, the tension palpable. Amelia Reyes was already at her table, her expression focused as she reviewed her notes. Across the aisle, Catherine Malone sat beside Ackerman, her cool exterior masking the desperation that Harper could see in her eyes. Ackerman himself appeared less composed. He shifted in his seat, his usual smirk replaced by a clenched jaw and restless hands. The gallery buzzed with anticipation. The reporters' pens hovered over their notepads, ready to capture every word. But it was the spectators who held Harper's attention. Among them were families who had lost everything to Ackerman's schemes. Their faces etched with quiet resolve. They were here for justice, not just for themselves, but for a system that had so often failed them. Reyes rose, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Thomas Bradford." A murmur rippled through the room as Bradford, the whistleblower who had previously been too afraid to testify, entered the courtroom. He looked visibly shaken, but there was a new determination in his step. Flanked by federal agents, he took the stand, his hands trembling as he was sworn in. "Mr. Bradford," Reyes began, her tone steady, "can you tell the court about your role at Ackerman Enterprises?" Bradford nodded, his voice wavering but clear. "I was a senior accountant. I handled payroll, expense reports, and internal audits. And during your time there, did you discover any irregularities?" "Yes," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I found evidence of money laundering, bribes, and embezzlement. Millions of dollars were being funneled into shell companies, all controlled by Mr. Ackerman." The gallery sat in stunned silence as Bradford detailed the inner workings of Ackerman's corruption. He described falsified records, offshore accounts, and coded emails used to coordinate illegal activities. Reyes guided him carefully, ensuring each revelation built on the last. But then, Bradford hesitated, his eyes darting toward Ackerman. Harper leaned forward, sensing the moment's weight. "Mr. Bradford," he said gently, "you're under oath. Please continue." Bradford took a deep breath. There was more. Ackerman didn't just steal money, he used it to destroy people. He paid off officials, sabotaged investigations, and arranged for accidents when people got in his way. A collective gasp erupted from the gallery. Harper struck his gavel, restoring order, but the room's energy was irrevocably changed. The unspoken truth had finally been laid bare. When Malone rose for cross-examination, her usual confidence seemed brittle. "Mr. Bradford," she began, her tone sharp, "you've admitted to participating in these activities. Why should this court believe you're telling the truth now?" "Because I kept records," Bradford shot back, his voice steadier now. "Emails, memos, transaction logs. I knew this day might come." Reyes handed Harper a thick folder. "Your Honor, these are the records Mr. Bradford referenced. They corroborate his testimony." Harper accepted the folder, his expression unreadable. "They will be admitted into evidence." Malone faltered, her next question stalling on her lips. For the first time, the defense had no immediate counter. Harper could feel the balance tipping toward truth. The afternoon session brought a new wave of tension. As Reyes prepared to introduce additional evidence, a court officer approached Harper with a note. He read it quickly, his expression darkening. The note was simple. "This doesn't end with the trial." Harper folded the note and set it aside, his voice steady as he addressed the courtroom. "Proceed." Reyes introduced a series of recordings from Ackerman's private meetings, provided by Cassandra Blake, his former assistant. In one recording, Ackerman could be heard laughing as he discussed manipulating city officials. "They'll take the money," he said. "They always do. And if they don't, we make them." The recordings were damning, painting a picture of a man who operated with impunity, his wealth a shield against accountability. The gallery sat in stunned silence, the weight of Ackerman's words hanging heavy in the air. As the session neared its end, Harper called for a brief recess. He returned to his chambers, the day's events replaying in his mind. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses compelling, but Harper knew better than to celebrate early. Power never surrendered without a fight. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Reyes, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "Your Honor," she said, "we've received word that Ackerman's team is trying to discredit Bradford's records. They're claiming they were doctored." Harper sighed, his shoulders tensing. "Do we have a counter?" "Yes," Reyes said, her voice firm. "The records were verified by independent auditors. But we need to act fast. If they plant doubt in the jury's mind, it could undo everything." Harper nodded, his mind racing. "Then we move quickly. Present the auditor's testimony first thing tomorrow." That night, as Harper prepared to leave the courthouse, he found himself surrounded by federal agents. The threats had escalated, and the precautions were necessary. But even as he walked to his car under their watchful eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that the trial was nearing its most dangerous point. At home, Linda waited for him, her worry evident in the way she hugged him tightly. "It's getting worse, Sam," she said softly. "How much more can you take?" Harper met her gaze, his voice steady. "As much as it takes." In his study, Harper reviewed the day's transcripts, his mind heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The trial had exposed not just Ackerman's corruption, but the deep fractures in the system, fractures shaped by money, power, and the silent but pervasive force of racial inequity. This wasn't just about one man. It was about a reckoning long overdue. Tomorrow would be critical. The trial was teetering on the edge, and Harper knew the next steps would determine more than just the verdict. They would determine whether the truth could prevail in a world so often ruled by lies. Harper leaned back in his chair, his gaze falling on the photograph of his family. He thought of Tommy, of the future he wanted to leave for him. This fight wasn't just about justice. It was about legacy, and Harper was ready to see it through to the end. The dawn broke in silence, a pale light spreading across the city as though it, too, were bracing for the events of the day. Judge Samuel Harper sat in his chambers, his gaze fixed on the transcript of the previous day's testimony. The trial had reached its final, precarious phase. Every moment had built to this, every revelation inching closer to an unavoidable collision. His coffee sat untouched on the desk, the steam curling upward like smoke from a battlefield. He could feel the weight of it all pressing against his chest, the threats, the lies, the unrelenting pressure to bend. But Harper was not a man who bent. He had made his choice long ago to stand firm, even when the ground beneath him trembled. A knock on the door broke his reverie. It was Amelia Reyes, her eyes sharp with purpose but underscored by the exhaustion of weeks spent in relentless pursuit of justice. "They're going to fight dirty today," she said without preamble, handing him a file. "Ackerman's team is claiming the auditors we called are biased. They've brought in their own experts to try to discredit everything." Harper nodded, flipping through the pages. "We anticipated this," he said calmly. "Stick to the facts. The jury knows what they've seen and heard." Reyes hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "They also know the power Ackerman holds. People are scared, Your Honor. The jurors, the witnesses, even the marshals." Harper set the file down, meeting her gaze. "Fear is what he's counting on. But fear doesn't win cases. Truth does." The courtroom was packed to capacity by the time Harper took his seat. The gallery buzzed with anticipation, the tension crackling like static electricity. Reporters hunched over their notebooks, ready to capture every word. Families sat in quiet solidarity, their faces a reminder of what this trial was truly about. Ackerman entered flanked by his legal team, his arrogance now tempered by the cracks in his once impenetrable facade. He looked less like a man in control and more like one grasping at the frayed edges of his empire. Reyes called her first witness of the day, Victor Hayes, the lead auditor who had verified Bradford's records. Hayes was a methodical man, his answers precise and deliberate as he explained the meticulous process used to authenticate the documents. "Mr. Hayes," Reyes said, her voice steady, "can you confirm that these records are accurate and unaltered?" "Yes," Hayes replied. "Every transaction, every email, every memo matches the original data from Ackerman Enterprises servers. There is no doubt that these documents are genuine." The gallery stirred, whispers rippling through the room. Harper watched as the jurors leaned in, their expressions a mix of intrigue and determination. Catherine Malone rose for cross-examination, her sharp heels clicking against the floor. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her tone clipped, "your firm has worked with the prosecution before, correct?" "Yes," Hayes admitted. "We've worked with law enforcement on several cases." "And would you say your firm's reputation depends on maintaining good relationships with government agencies?" Hayes frowned, his composure unwavering. "Our reputation depends on our accuracy and integrity, not on who we work with." Malone's smirk faltered slightly, but she pressed on. "Isn't it possible that your firm's involvement in this case was motivated by bias or a desire to secure future contracts?" "No," Hayes said firmly. "Our motivation was to uncover the truth." As the day wore on, the defense's attempts to undermine the evidence grew increasingly desperate. They called their own experts, who made convoluted arguments about data inconsistencies and procedural errors. But each time, Reyes countered with a calm, precise rebuttal, her confidence growing with every exchange. The gallery was riveted, the tension in the room building like a coiled spring. Harper could feel it, the slow but inevitable momentum carrying them toward a breaking point. The climax came in the final hour of the session. Reyes introduced a last-minute piece of evidence, a recording from one of Ackerman's private meetings. Captured by Cassandra Blake. In the recording, Ackerman's voice was clear and cold. "If Harper doesn't back down," he said, "we'll make him. Everyone has a weakness. Find his." The room erupted. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as the weight of Ackerman's arrogance crashed over the courtroom. Harper struck his gavel, his voice booming. "Order." Ackerman shot to his feet, his composure finally shattering. "This is a setup," he bellowed. "A witch hunt. You're all against me. Mr. Ackerman, sit down," Harper commanded, his voice like steel. Ackerman glared at him, his fists clenched, but he obeyed. The outburst had only solidified what everyone already knew. The man who had once considered himself untouchable was unraveling before their eyes. That evening, Harper sat alone in his chambers, the day's events replaying in his mind. The trial was nearly over, but the fight was far from finished. He thought of the jurors, who would soon bear the burden of deciding Ackerman's fate. He thought of the witnesses, who had risked everything to speak the truth. And he thought of the gallery, the families, the workers, the ordinary people whose lives had been destroyed by Ackerman's greed. A knock at the door startled him. It was Julia, his clerk, her face pale. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling, "there's been another threat. They found a package outside the courthouse. The bomb squad is on its way." Harper nodded, his expression grim. "Thank you, Julia. Tell the marshals to keep everyone safe." She hesitated. "Are you safe, sir?" Harper managed a small, tired smile. "Safe enough." Late that night, as Harper prepared to leave, he paused to look at the empty courtroom. The seats were vacant, the lights dimmed, but the weight of the day lingered in the air. This place, this trial, was more than a battle over one man's guilt. It was a crucible for the entire system, a test of whether justice could withstand the pressures of power, privilege, and fear. He thought of his grandson, Tommy, and the future he wanted to leave for him. This fight wasn't just about Ackerman. It was about ensuring that truth, no matter how dangerous, could still prevail. With a deep breath, Harper stepped into the night, his resolve unshaken. The reckoning was near, and he was ready. The courtroom was impossibly still. Judge Samuel Harper sat at the bench, his dark eyes surveying the room as the morning session began. The weight of anticipation pressed against the walls, the air thick with an almost oppressive silence. Harper had seen his share of high-profile cases, but this was different. Today, the trial of Jonathan Ackerman wasn't just about guilt or innocence, it was about whether the truth could stand unbroken in the face of unrelenting power. The gallery was packed with spectators, their faces a tapestry of hope, fear, and quiet determination. Reporters lined the back row, their pens poised to capture every word, every flicker of emotion. And in the jury box, 12 ordinary citizens sat rigid, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Ackerman entered the room surrounded by his defense team, his face a mask of barely restrained fury. His usual arrogance had been replaced by something more volatile, more dangerous. He was a man cornered, and everyone knew it. The session began with Amelia Reyes calling her final witness, Margaret Wilson, the community leader who had uncovered Ackerman's manipulation of housing projects. Margaret took the stand with a calm, deliberate grace, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Ms. Wilson," Reyes began, her voice steady, "can you describe the impact of Mr. Ackerman's actions on your community?" Margaret's gaze swept the courtroom, her voice carrying the weight of years of struggle. "He didn't just take money, he took hope. He made promises that he never intended to keep. And when we tried to hold him accountable, he destroyed us. Families lost their homes, schools closed, people left because they had no choice." Reyes nodded, her next question precise. "And did you attempt to report these actions?" "Yes," Margaret said. "We went to the city council, to the police, to anyone who would listen. But nothing happened. Every time we got close, the evidence would disappear. Or worse, someone would threaten us to stay quiet." Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the system's failure. Harper watched the jurors closely, noting the way they shifted in their seats, their eyes heavy with the realization that this case was bigger than any one man. When Catherine Malone rose for cross-examination, her tone was sharp. almost desperate. "Ms. Wilson, isn't it true that your organization received funding from Mr. Ackerman's company?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, at first. And didn't you personally sign a letter thanking him for his contributions?" "I did," Margaret admitted, "because I believed him. I believed he cared about our community. But that money was just a way to cover his tracks." Malone pressed harder, her voice rising. "So you're saying you took his money, benefited from it, and now you're accusing him of corruption? Isn't that convenient?" Margaret's voice didn't waver. "We didn't benefit. We trusted him, and he betrayed that trust. That's not convenience, it's the truth." The tension in the room grew unbearable as Reyes introduced her closing argument. She stood before the jury, her voice calm but commanding. "This case is not just about Jonathan Ackerman," she began. "It's about every person who has ever been silenced by money, by fear, by a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the powerless." She gestured to the gallery, where families sat holding hands, their eyes fixed on the jury. "These people are not asking for special treatment. They're asking for justice. They're asking for a system that works for them, not just for men like Mr. Ackerman." Her voice rose, carrying the weight of her conviction. "You've seen the evidence. You've heard the testimonies. Now, it's up to you to decide whether the truth matters." Malone's closing argument was equally impassioned but rang hollow in comparison. She painted Ackerman as a victim of political ambition, a successful businessman targeted by those jealous of his achievements. Her words felt rehearsed, her tone calculated, and as she spoke, Harper saw the jury's expressions harden, their patience wearing thin. The day ended with the jury's deliberation. Harper returned to his chambers, the silence a stark contrast to the chaos of the courtroom. He sat at his desk, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at the photograph of his grandson. The threats, the lies, the violence, it had all led to this moment. Harper thought of the jurors, ordinary people tasked with an extraordinary responsibility. He thought of the witnesses who had risked everything to speak the truth. And he thought of Ackerman, a man who had spent his life believing he was untouchable. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Julia, his clerk, her face pale. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling, "the jury has reached a verdict." The courtroom was silent as the jurors filed in, their faces unreadable. Harper watched as Patricia Bennett, the foreperson, stood to deliver the verdict. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant guilty." The gallery erupted in gasps and whispers. But Harper struck his gavel sharply, restoring order. Bennett continued, her voice steady. "On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit arson, we find the defendant guilty." As the litany of guilty verdicts continued, Harper glanced at Ackerman. The man who had once radiated unshakable confidence now sat slumped in his chair, his face ashen, his empire crumbling around him. When Bennett finished, Harper addressed the courtroom. "The defendant will be remanded to federal custody pending sentencing. This trial is adjourned." As the gallery erupted into cheers and tears, Harper sat back in his chair, his expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The fight was over, but the work was just beginning. Justice had prevailed, but the system that allowed Ackerman's corruption to flourish still needed to be rebuilt. Harper stood, his gaze sweeping the room one last time. He thought of the people who had been silenced, of the communities that had been broken. This victory was for them, but it was also a reminder of how much further they had to go. As he left the courtroom, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The truth had won, but Harper knew the fight for justice was far from over. It was a battle that would continue, one trial at a time, until the system reflected the ideals it claimed to uphold. And Harper would be there, standing firm, no matter how long it took. The courthouse was quieter than it had been in weeks. The crowds were gone, the gallery empty, and the reporters had packed up their cameras and microphones. Yet the echoes of the trial lingered, as if the building itself were holding onto the gravity of what had just transpired. Judge Samuel Harper stood in his chambers, staring out the window at the city that had been at the center of this storm. The trial of Jonathan Ackerman was over, but its aftermath rippled far beyond the courtroom. For weeks, Harper had stood as the face of an embattled system, his every decision scrutinized, his integrity questioned, and now, with the verdict delivered and justice seemingly served, he found himself contemplating the cost. That morning, Harper made his way to a local community center. He had been invited to speak to a group of residents from the neighborhoods most affected by Ackerman's scheme's, families who had lost their homes, retirees whose pensions had been wiped out, and activists who had fought for years to bring Ackerman to justice. The room was small but packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. Harper scanned the crowd, his gaze lingering on the faces of people who had lived the consequences of the corruption he had helped expose. Some were wary, their trust in the system still fragile. Others looked at him with quiet gratitude, their eyes reflecting a hope they hadn't dared to feel in years. As he stepped to the front of the room, Harper felt the weight of their expectations settle on his shoulders. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but warm. "I stand before you today not as a judge, but as a man who believes that justice must belong to everyone." He spoke about the trial, not in legal terms but as a story of resilience, courage, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. He acknowledged the flaws in the system, the ways it had failed them, and the work that remained to be done. "Justice," Harper said, "isn't something that happens in a vacuum. It requires people willing to speak up, even when their voices tremble. It requires communities that refuse to be silenced, even when the odds are stacked against them. And it requires all of us inside and outside the courtroom to hold each other accountable." The crowd was silent, the weight of his words settling over them. Then, a young woman in the front row stood, her voice trembling but clear. "How do we trust the system again? After everything that's happened, how do we believe it will ever change?" Harper met her gaze, his expression somber but resolute. "Trust isn't built overnight," he said. "It's earned, one step at a time. But I believe in the power of truth. And I believe in people like you, people who demand better. Change doesn't come easy, but it starts with refusing to accept anything less." The conversation continued, the residents sharing their stories, their frustrations, and their hopes. Harper listened intently, his heart heavy with the knowledge that for many of them, the scars left by Ackerman's corruption would never fully heal. But amidst the pain, there was also a sense of possibility. Margaret Wilson spoke about the plans to rebuild her community, this time with proper oversight and transparency. Thomas Bradford shared how he was working with local organizations to create better protections for whistleblowers. And young people in the room talked about stepping into leadership roles, determined to ensure that history didn't repeat itself. That evening, Harper returned to his chambers, the day's conversations replaying in his mind. He sat at his desk, surrounded by the remnants of the trial files, transcripts, and evidence that told the story of a system pushed to its breaking point. A knock at the door startled him. It was Amelia Reyes, carrying a stack of papers. "You're still here?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just tying up loose ends," Harper replied with a faint smile. Reyes set the papers on his desk, her expression softening. "The DOJ is forming a task force to investigate corruption across the state. They want me to lead it." Harper's smile widened. "They couldn't have chosen better." Reyes hesitated, then added, "And they want you to serve as an advisor." Harper's expression grew thoughtful. He had spent decades in the judiciary, navigating the complexities of a system that often seemed stacked against the people it was meant to protect. The idea of stepping into a new role, one where he could help shape the future, was both daunting and invigorating. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "But for now, I need to finish what I started here." The next morning, Harper attended Ackerman's sentencing. The courtroom was subdued, the atmosphere heavy with finality. Ackerman stood before the bench, his once polished demeanor replaced by a hollow defiance. Harper delivered the sentence with the same calm authority he had carried throughout the trial. "Mr. Ackerman," he said, "your actions have caused immeasurable harm to countless people. This court sentences you to 35 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole." The gallery remained silent as the marshals led Ackerman away. For all his wealth and power, he was now just another man held accountable for his crimes. As Harper left the courthouse, he paused on the steps, the cool morning air filling his lungs. He thought of his grandson, Tommy, who had asked him once what it meant to be brave. "It means standing up," Harper had told him, "even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The city stretched out before him, its skyline a testament to resilience and reinvention. The trial was over, but the work of justice was never done. Harper had spent his life fighting for a system that was often imperfect. But he believed in its potential. And as he descended the steps, his heart was lighter, his resolve stronger. The truth had prevailed, and the fight would continue.